This is Kick-Ass News. I'm Ben Mathis. Staying a step ahead of cyber threats can be the difference between thriving and being thwarted. Afternoon Cyber Tea with Ann Johnson has insights for cybersecurity decision makers striving to succeed amid rapid change. Each week, Ann Johnson, Corporate Vice President for Cybersecurity Solutions at Microsoft, talks with key security experts to explore perspectives on implementing new tech, next-generation security risks, and the current and future state of the cybersecurity industry. Afternoon Cyber Tea is available on Apple Podcasts and Podcast One.
Dr. Fauci said earlier this week that the lag in testing was, in fact, a failing. Do you take responsibility for that?
Yeah, no, I don't take responsibility at all.
Those words of Donald Trump at a March 13th press conference are likely to be history's epitaph on his presidency. A huge swath of Americans has put their faith in Trump and Trump only because they see the rest of the country building a future that doesn't have a place for them. If they would risk their lives for Trump in a pandemic, they will certainly risk the stability of American democracy. They brought the Trumpocalypse upon the country, and a post-Trumpocalypse country will have to find a way either to reconcile them to democracy or to protect democracy from them. It's all in a new book by lifelong Republican and former speechwriter to George W. Bush, David Frum. It's called Trumpocalypse: Restoring American Democracy. And today, David joins me on the podcast to discuss Trump's handling of the COVID-19 crisis, how Trump is encouraging disinformation and dangerous conspiracy theories about this deadly virus, and whether Republicans may finally get on board with voting rights reforms now that it's a literal matter of life and death. He discusses how President Trump's dangerous pattern of decision-making continually makes matters worse, and says that some deep state isn't out to stop him. He is his own deep state, constantly self-sabotaging his own agenda, while well-meaning advisors and civil servants desperately try to save Donald Trump from Donald Trump. He describes Trumpism as an affinity fraud, asks what will happen when Trump's supporters realize they've been duped, and ponders what will become of the Republican Party and our democratic institutions when Trump and Trumpism are relegated to the ash heap of history. Coming up with David Frum in just a moment. From 2001 to 2002, David Frum served as a speechwriter and special assistant to President George W. Bush. He's a senior editor at The Atlantic and the author of 9 books, including the New York Times bestseller, Trumpocracy. Now he's out with a follow-up to that book called Trumpocalypse: Restoring American Democracy. David Frum, welcome to the show.
Hey, Ben, thank you.
Well, David, I have to hand it to you. The title to this book, Trumpocalypse, could not possibly describe the current moment better.
God help us.
I suspect more accurately than even you have imagined. What inspired the title? I assume that came up before all of this happened.
It came up before it happened. The title is the work of the book's brilliant editor, a man named Eric Nelson. And the book describes sort of as you said, I wrote a book in 2018 that was a book of warning, and this book is a book of assessment of where we've been, and the assessment's pretty tough. And so Eric proposed this title, and I don't know, it might seem a little overstating things, but yeah, as you say, the apocalypse showed up on just. I don't want to say on time because there's never a good time for an apocalypse.
Right. As scheduled. Do you have any doubt that your former boss, George W. Bush, would have done a way better job of handling this nightmare than the current president?
Look, one of the things I've been saying a lot about this crisis is in a pandemic, it's extremely difficult to get an A, but very easy to deserve a B. And what we have seen, so I don't want to make any special claim for George W. Bush or anybody else. I think there are a lot of people in American politics and outside who would have done a good job. What's needed is listen to the scientists, act quickly and decisively, accept that you're going to make mistakes early on when you have imperfect information, project empathy, be caring, always put human life ahead of short-term economic benefit. Those are the basics, and leaders
So
all over the
everything
world.
that Trump does not do or has
Every
not
yeah.
done.
So
Wow.
I mean, lots of countries. I mean, there have been leaders who have achieved outstanding successes, but even leaders who have done only a so-so job. France is suffering a lot of terrible hardship and has not managed this virus especially well. But the leaders in France, people understand they care, they're doing their best, and it's a difficult situation. So yeah, I think Mitt Romney would have done a great job. I think Jimmy Carter, who had many failings as
Really?
well. I mean, this is a technical job combined with a little bit of emotional decency. And as I say, maybe if you were an extraordinary leader, you'd have acted decisively in December and January and headed this thing off at the pass. But even if you failed to do that, you could still do the kind of job that Angela Merkel has done in Germany or Justin Trudeau in Canada.
And what amazes me, and this is not unique to the pandemic, but he plays both sides of the whole thing. He just kind of goes through the motions of trying to protect Americans and talk about rushing a vaccine and making test kits available, while at the same time he's downplaying the number of deaths and contradicting his own advisors. Or he'll initially express disapproval of Georgia's reopening, but then he'll cheer on a hasty reopening later or in another state. He really seems to think that he can have it both ways. And I guess we'll either let it slide or won't remember.
Well, there is an emerging national policy, but it's so harsh that the people who advocate it don't want to say it out loud. And I've been calling it that the real plan is take the punch. That what the Trump people have learned over the past few months is that this virus is not, in fact, the equal opportunity killer people said it was at the beginning. It hits some people much harder than others. And although it hits the very old, the people in nursing homes, that people in their 50s and 60s who have the economic resources to shelter in place, well, that's my group. We haven't suffered so much. The suffering is done by the very old, who are disproportionately female, by minorities, by people who are on the front lines of indispensable occupations. And the Trump people have decided, we care a lot more about boosting the stock market than we care about those people. How many are we going to lose anyway? Maybe 100,000, maybe 200,000. It's a big country. They weren't going to vote for us. Take the punch. Let it rip. And that's where we're going. And this takes me to the larger themes of the book I've just published, because Trumpocalypse is not a book so much about Donald Trump personally, but about the working out of the political system that he represents and the failings in larger failings in American life, because many of the things that have gone wrong in this pandemic are much bigger than Donald Trump, especially the economic failures.
Yeah, and one of the things that concerns me most is just all the disinformation and conspiracy theories out there. And not just from kooky QAnon people, but people that I know, people that I see on Facebook who I otherwise think of as normal, fairly rational people. Do you think that he either overtly or more subtly has fanned the flames of these wild and frankly dangerous conspiracy theories? I mean, nutty stuff like it's all a plan by Bill Gates and the New World Order to keep us under their boot, and there is no coronavirus and stuff like that.
Well, of course, Trump has fanned the conspiracy theory because he needs to. His plan to take the punch and accept casualties among the people who don't vote for him in order to boost the stock market becomes a much more plausible plan if you say, and the casualties aren't so bad. The virus it's all being exaggerated by the libtards. Really, it's like a bad flu, for goodness sakes. Let's all return to normal, and that. So the conspiracizing helps him with the actual plan. We also have a problem of, because if you're going to be a Donald Trump supporter, there's a lot of reality denying you have to do. And so it's not just a fringe element who are pulled into this whole alternative information system. It's much of the heart and core of the Republican Party, in which I spent so much of my career.
Yeah, and it's funny because I was a Republican since before I could vote, and I just don't remember the tinfoil hat stuff and all the QAnon type conspiracies existing in the Republican Party up and through George W. Bush. Was this always there, or where does that come from?
Well, social media is a big culprit here. Look,
Hmm.
there in every town there was always a crazy person. Before Facebook, the crazy person might not agree that he was crazy, but at least he knew that all his neighbors thought he was crazy,
Yeah.
and he had to govern himself accordingly. He had to be careful with his. Uh, a friend of mine tells a funny story about his father, who was a New York City policeman for many, many years, and at regular intervals would get calls from people who would say at the station the Russians were eavesdropping on their thoughts with their mind control rays, and my friend's father is a very good humored man, would say, "Look, we hear this a lot. I recommend you go out and buy yourself a new hat and line the inside of the hat with aluminum foil. And if you wear that all the time, the Russians won't be able to do it." And one caller got suspicious and said, "Wait a minute. If you get this call all the time, why don't you do something about it?" And my friend's dad sort of sighed wearily and said, "I'd like to, but these liberal judges." And the caller found that a perfectly acceptable answer. Okay, so now all those people are finding each other and forming groups and reinforcing each other and self-radicalizing. So a lot of these people are showing up at state houses with guns to are people who found each other through the anti-vaccination movement, which is the craziest thing there is, just about. And those people used to be alone, but they now have the power of numbers. There are 320 odd million people in the United States. If just a fraction of them are crazy, that's a lot of crazy people.
And you even say that there's a phenomenon going on among these people that I've seen myself on social media recently. You say that Trump supporters even feel like they would be betraying their ideals or their president if they took precautions against COVID-19. And that's a little bit surprising to me, because I guess I would imagine that the majority of doomsday preppers probably lean heavily Republican or at least heavily libertarian.
Yeah. Well, look, I think right now the saddest people in the world have to be the doomsday preppers. So here it is. So you
but this is what they've been waiting for, isn't it?
No, it's like this terribly ironic kick in the. So yes, it's what you. So okay, I'm waiting.
They
for the
can finally say, "I told you so."
Right. Except the doomsday they were preparing for was one in which U.S. currency would become worthless and all their tins of beans would become the currency. And instead, we have a global pandemic in which if you've got U.S. currency, you can have the beans. They will be delivered to your door. There's no point in having 10-year-old beans from underneath the backyard. So, hey, the one-star Michelin restaurant in your town will gladly, deliver a home-cooked meal to you if you have money. And so the whole premise of prepping was the money was going to become worthless. And and people are desperate for it. So the whole scheme is wrong. You didn't have to dig the hole. You didn't have to save the beans. Your local department store, your local restaurant will be delighted to deliver anything if you have cash.
Yeah, I'm kind of surprised how this has all worked out, because even I, when it first hit, I started trying to stock up on canned goods and make sure that we had enough food in case supply chains got disrupted, which they have to a certain extent, but nowhere to the extent that I imagined. I worried about protecting my family. What if police start calling in sick and, chaos reigns? But in a weird way, I'm kind of impressed at how well we've weathered that aspect of it.
Well, there are things about this crisis that show the success of our society. I mean, there were times in the history of humanity when if you had some plague that prevented people from working or many, many people from working for 2 or 3 months, the society would have starved. I mean, there would have been famine. We have this extraordinary advanced civilization where, people are going through economic hardship and there are layoffs, and I don't want to diminish any of that, but the society is able to keep people eating and functioning and the lights on and the internet working, and that's all amazing. But there are things that there are bad reflections here too. And there are questions of why has the United States not been able to organize an effective unemployment insurance system? In most other advanced countries right now, in Canada, in Britain, in Germany, and Australia is coming out the other end of this. Most people who lose their jobs are are receiving a check from either the government or from their employer for about 80% of their normal pay, and that will continue indefinitely. And it's a 20%, it's a 20-point pay cut. That's not nothing. And if you're, just getting by, I'm sure it hurts, but it works. I did a tweet. I'm originally from Canada. I have a house there and spend time there. I did a tweet that it's one of these things. It's like one of the things he tweeted at 11 in the night, and it's like a very small thing. And anyway, it went wild because people found this so amazing. I was talking to two friends of mine who own a winery near where my house is in Prince Edward County, Ontario, and they got hit by this thing. It's a tourist area, and they're dependent on customers. They applied for the Government of Canada grant for small businesses, which is 40,000 Canadian dollars. It's not a huge sum of money, but it's very widely available. It took them 12 minutes to fill out the form. They pressed the button, 2 minutes while the little beach ball of death spins. and then at the end of the 2 minutes, there's a message, you've been approved. And 48 hours later, the $40,000 was in their bank account. So I told this little story on Twitter, and it gets like 50,000 repeats because no small businessman in the United States or business person in the United States that is not what happened in the United States. It's been a chaos. And the question is why? I mean, Canadians and Americans so alike. Systems of government, system of law, and why is one society able to organize an effective response to the trouble of small business and the other not? And that is not just a Donald Trump story. That goes into some of the deeper issues that I try to talk about in Trumpocalypse.
And I want to talk more deeply about Trumpism and what's happened in this country. You actually described Trumpism as an affinity fraud.
Yeah.
Now, that for anyone who doesn't know, that's a scam where the mark feels something in common with the fraudster.
Right.
And I wonder, why is that? Why do so many working class white males gravitate to this huckster? I mean, he has nothing in common with them, blatantly so.
Yeah.
He wouldn't give them the time of day if he wasn't running for president. And it's not even like he's Mitt Romney or someone who at least went through the motions of trying to be a regular Joe. How do you explain that?
Yeah. In the previous book, Trumpocracy, I described this a little bit. The difference between Trump and Mitt Romney is Mitt Romney's good looking. He's slim. He was good at school. He coasted through life. He met a beautiful woman at a young age. She instantly fell in love with him. They got married. They stayed married, and they have challenges. She's got multiple sclerosis. I mean, life is not a walk in the park for anybody. But his children love him, and his many grandchildren, and he's just one of life's winners, and that's not an easy thing to get past.
Right.
The secret of Trump was he's inwardly a loser. I mean, no matter for all his wealth and the gilding, he feels like a loser, and he shows it on Twitter. But he's a loser who became a kind of winner. He became president of the United States, but he never feels like it. And he also is consumed with resentment and rage, and of people he thinks are laughing at him and looking down on him. And that's what appeals. And he, there's been a lot of attention, and it's absolutely deserved, to Trump and his ugly attitudes toward race. But more than his racial animus, Trump is a man consumed with disdain for women. And at a time when the sexes live separate, never in the history of statistics have men and women under age 30 been less likely to live together in the United States than they are today. I think the number I saw was that if you're under 30, you're more likely to be living with your parents than you are with a husband or wife. So he captures a lot of anguish and a lot of resentment and a lot of rage that a lot of people in a certain kind of group have, and that is the affinity on his folks, and it allows him to defraud people. He's always used that affinity to exploit and take advantage and steal from people and swindle them, and he's doing it first in business and now as president.
How does one open Trump voters' eyes to the fact that they were duped in 2016 without insulting them or making them dig in even deeper? I mean, psychologically, a lot of people would rather double down on failure than ever admit that they got played for a fool.
Well, I talk about that in the book a little bit, about how if you've ever known anybody who's been through a swindle, and if you try to help them, they will never forgive you. That they will forgive the swindler, but because he just took their money, you made them, by warning them, you made them feel stupid. And that they and we prefer as human beings a lie that validates us to a truth that challenges us. But Donald Trump is not the way. You don't lose elections in the United States by losing your core supporters. And just one point: 1932, Great Depression, Americans literally going hungry. Herbert Hoover still got 38% of the vote, so he didn't lose his base. That's why they call it a base. Trump's in trouble politically because he's losing a lot of people who grudgingly put up with him in 2016, and because while 2016 was a relatively low turnout election, 2020 is going to be a high turnout election. So there are going to be a lot more minorities, a lot more young people. The groups he's in trouble with are working class white women. He's in trouble. He actually did surprisingly well in 2016 with Latino men. I mean, not great, but I think he got like a quarter of the Latino male vote. There's a big gender gap in the Latino world. I can't tell you why, but there is. And he did well with Latino men, and he did surprisingly not too terribly with black men. He got 10% or more of the black male vote. Okay, so I think those groups, he's going to get nothing in Black America, male, female. He's going to do badly with Latino men. They are the front lines of both exposure to the virus and unemployment. The Black communities in your state, whatever the number of whatever the percent of the Black population, double that, you get the number of Black deaths in your state. So if your state is 20% Black, your state's deaths are 40% Black. In the South, where there are states that are 40% Black, you have death toll among the death toll will be 80% Black. It's horrifying. And he's losing ground among the women in the lives of his male base supporters. So that's enough to defeat him. How do we restabilize the country after? That's the big question I try to figure out in this book, because if you've got a big chunk of the country that is willing to go along with an authoritarian criminal, how do you govern that country? And so the book, it tries to answer, given that we've got this problem of this group of people who have pledged themselves or been seduced by this sinister kind of politics, how do we work around them? That's the thing I try to answer.
And there's something that you sort of touched on here, which is the radical elements within MAGA land have been labeled as white nationalists. But kind of what you were alluding to a second ago is that's not really an accurate label. What would you call that movement and why?
Well, I'm stumbling. There are a lot of words that we try to stumble around for the Trump world. Some people call them populists, as you say, white nationalists. And my problem with the term white nationalist is, first, the core of the MAGA movement is not very national. In fact, it's an international movement. And I go into this in the book about how, this is an international movement where, when in the most extreme cases, when you get like a shooter who attacks American immigrants, what you discover is they're obsessed with migration into Europe, which has been a very tense situation, but that somehow what is happening on the borders of Austria is more real to them than what is happening in Arizona. And it's not exactly white, because many of the most aggressive MAGA people are not white or would not conventionally be regarded as white. That there's a kind of ideology about how whites are best, but many of the people who express that ideology, it is kind of only an America quality. The thing about America is this is a country where we have so much opportunity that even our Nazis can be Jewish.
Right.
But the Nazis often are Jewish, and the racists often are not white. And so I stumble around. The term I end up coming up with, and it's not a very perfect term, is if you remember your high school science, you know how if you've got something that's like an alkaline, but it's not exactly an alkaline, it'll be called an alkaloid. If you've got something that's like a planet, it's not exactly a planet, it gets called a planetoid. So I propose the term fascoid. It's not exactly fascism, but it's sort of like it. And the problem with fascism is it's such an emotive, as a word, it's so emotive we can't use it in political science anymore to describe, so I don't mean like people in Hugo Boss suits who are movie villains, with British accents, which the Nazis famously had. But what I mean are people who have ideas that are like those that move people on the European far right in the 1930s, and not primarily or only in Germany, but in places like Romania and Portugal, that was a body of ideas like communism that continues to have power, and it's back, and in a serious way, and not only in this country, but in other developed countries too.
We're going to take a quick break, and then we'll return with more when we come back in just a moment. Folks, I'm very excited to tell you about my new sponsor. They make some fantastic coffee, and they also do a lot of good in the world. In 2014, Evan Hafer and Army Ranger Matt Best founded Black Rifle Coffee Company to combine two passions, developing premium roast-to-order coffee and supporting the veteran and military community. And recently, they donated over 20,000 bags of coffee to medical workers on the front lines of the pandemic. BRCC offers a variety of roast profiles, all sourced around the world through a rigorous process and roasted in Tennessee and Utah. Evan started roasting his own coffee in 2006 to bring with him overseas during his 20-plus years as an infantryman, Special Forces soldier, and CIA contractor. He even refitted his Humvee to roast coffee during deployments. Now BRCC currently employs over 200 vets and plans to employ 10,000 eventually. With the Buy a Bag, Give a Bag campaign, BRCC donated over 30,000 pounds of coffee to troops overseas in 2019. Join BRCC's Coffee Club, a free subscription where your chosen coffee is roasted, packaged, and shipped free to your door on your schedule. You also receive discounts and gain access to exclusive products, content, and more. Head to blackriflecoffee.com/kick to order and use promo code KICK for 20% off. That's blackriflecoffee.com/kick with code KICK for 20% off. Trump talks about whatever you want to call them, white nationalists or just this radical element like the Proud Boys and other groups, as if they're some sort of minions of his. But is he lying to himself by thinking that he has control over these movements? Are they taking their cues from him, or is it the other way around?
These movements are bigger than him, and they will be here after him. And in a way, because he never quite understood his own success. I mean, Trump ended up being a very conventional kind of Republican in most ways. I mean, that what he figured out. Like here's what went wrong for conventional Republicans in 2016. So they're getting all these messages from their base, from the Republican voters. Look, we've been through the Great Recession. We've been through the Iraq War. We're sort of done with you all. And what we want is less immigration, more health care, and no more Bushes. And the Republican donor class says, right, what we're going to give you is less health care, more immigration, and one more Bush. And so hence Trump, that he understood those things. But in office, he then proceeded to roll back healthcare delivery. Republicans wanted more, and he delivered less. In fact, Americans lost their health insurance in the Trump years, even in a time of an expanding economy. He never had a real immigration plan. The wall is not responsive. I mean, it's a giant, stupid public works project that doesn't acknowledge that at this point, something like nearly half of the illegal immigrants in the United States arrive by airplane and arrive legally in the first place, and then overstay a visa. And they come by airplane. So, that if you want to deal with that problem, you have to have a better system for making sure that people who enter on a visa, in fact, do exit, and some way of doing something if they overstay the visa. But the wall is just pointless. And he made it a sort of a symbol for a culture war issue for his base, but he never delivered. In fact, immigration before the pandemic, immigration under Trump was running at, illegal immigration, I should say, was running at levels not seen since the 1990s. So he just didn't deliver because he didn't understand it. And then he did the classic Republican stuff of the top-heavy tax cut, those kinds of things.
Yeah, you described this pattern with Trump where he doesn't respect government or his advisors, so he'll hastily put forth a poorly thought out policy, and then when it inevitably turns into a disaster, he tries to reassert control over the situation by overcompensating and pushing more extreme and often harmful versions of that policy. The perfect case in point being family separations at the border.
Right. Well, that is such an important story. It's a terrible thing and a stain on the conscience of the country. And one of the things I think when you look at it, people didn't understand. This was never a plan. This was never a plan. This was all based on an experiment that somebody did in El Paso with about a dozen border crossers, to find out if you detain the adults and children separately, did that have a deterrent effect? And in this tiny little section of the border near El Paso, yes, it did. It did. It was so it seemed. So this experiment involving, if I remember right, about 60 families, and became a data point that then began to circulate in a memo. Now, here's the thing: when you separate 60 kids from 60 parents, it's hard. You're not going to lose 60 kids. Like the question of where are they, what happened to them, what's your plan for putting them back together with the parents and sending them back home? That's on a scale of 60. That's very manageable. When you then turn that 60 into a percent and then circulate it and say, let's do this along the entire length of the border because it seemed to work in El Paso. Remember, they weren't trying to separate families. They were trying to deter border crossers. And border crossers in 2017 and 2018 especially meant not just illegal immigrants in the classic sense, but asylum seekers. Because whereas Mexicans who came to the United States in the great age of illegal immigration from Mexico, they came as single young men. They crossed the border looking for work. They sent money home, and they would often cross back and forth because they were usually not traveling that far. When people are coming from Guatemala or West Africa, that's much farther. So they come in family groups. They try to bring their kids, and then they seek. And being an asylum seeker is not breaking the law. It's a legal thing to seek asylum, and there's then a process where they don't want to evade the border crossing guards. In fact, they want to turn themselves in so they can be entered into the system, get their temporary papers, and be assigned a date years later when they're supposed to show up in a court. But they're legal to work and have their families until their court date. So asylum, it's a broken system. It no longer is responsive to the world of today, but it's the law. And that was the thing that the Trump people were trying to deter with this former policy of family separation, never imagining that they would become responsible for the welfare of thousands of minors, and in some cases, very young minors. And then it became this tremendous atrocity. And they kept making it worse because they couldn't ever admit, this thing we just didn't do the paperwork. We didn't do a proper experiment. We just overgeneralized from one small experience.
This pattern of self-sabotage, it would be laughable if it weren't so deadly serious. And every time he bungles something, it's never somehow his fault. It's always the deep state out to get him.
Yeah.
Yet the so-called deep state consists of patriotic, lifelong civil servants and often people who supported his campaign and whom he himself appointed. They're not out to get him. Their only goal is to help him be effective at his job and achieve his goals in a way that helps the country instead of hurting it. The problem isn't the supposed deep state. The problem is him every time.
I have a chapter in the book called Deep State. And he is the deep state. Look, the phrase deep state is a political science term. It comes from the study of all things Turkey in the 1950s. So the Turkey set up, there's a revolution in Turkey, and power is taken by someone who's super not religious. In fact, blames Turkey's religious heritage for Turkey's problems. But the problem is the Turkish people are very religious. So he sets up a system where there are elections, but the military and the intelligence services lurk in the background, and they're committed to secular ideals. And they warn the politicians, you can govern the way you want, you can even steal a little bit, but if you start doing religion, we'll take the power away from you. So the deep state was this state within a state of informal power that existed independent of elections. And then people who study these things applied the term to other similar countries with military and intelligence services, Pakistan and Egypt. So Donald Trump wants to say, well, the FBI is like that. But here's the thing. The point to a deep state is it's informal, undisclosed power. Donald Trump kept doing things where he was acting in an undisclosed way. Look, if he wanted to say, hey, Russia is our new best friend, people. He was the duly elected president. He took the oath. He has the power to appoint officials. If he wanted to appoint a pro-Russia Secretary of State a pro-Russian national security advisor, invite Putin to Washington as his first visitor, give a speech to Congress about how Russia is to be our new best friend. He had the power to do all of those things, and he had the majority in Congress. He could have pushed it through. What instead Trump would do in area after area is he would pretend that he would sign the paperwork for one policy. He would enact the laws for one policy. He would sign a bill saying we're going to have sanctions on Russia. That would be the law. And then he would break his own law. He was the deep
Right.
state. He was the little conspiracy against he had the power to change. He didn't have these things that he's complaining about. He could have changed any of them at any time. There would have been a political hit maybe, but he was his own conspirator inside his own government. And that's the story of the Ukraine thing. If you want to say, you know what, we're not helping Ukraine anymore. Sorry. We agree with the Russian invasion. Pick a Ukrainian ambassador who agrees with you. Make that case to Congress. Tell the American people, you're the president. You'll always find people willing to do your work. Make the case. But he pretended that the Ukrainians were our friend, the way, continuing the policy of Bush and Obama before him. And then in secret, not telling anybody, he had a different policy for his own personal advantage.
Well, it begs the question, looking ahead to the election, after 4 years of bungling being the man at the top, can Trump still run as the Washington outsider and the reformer? And if he tries to make that case that he's still some kind of outsider and his efforts at reform were sabotaged by the Democrats or the deep state or whatever you want to call it, will people buy it? Like Harry Truman said, the buck stops here. So how far can he get away with shirking responsibility for his own failures?
Presidents have survived high unemployment before. Ronald Reagan in 1984 faced, I think, something like 7.2% unemployment, and Barack Obama in 2012 at something like 7.7. But in both cases, that unemployment had been coming down very, very fast in the year before the election. About 2 million more Americans were working on voting day in 2012 than had been working 12 months earlier. About 4 million more Americans were working on voting day in 1984 than had been working 12 months earlier. So you could feel, even if you're out of work on voting day, things are obviously getting better. In 1984, things are obviously getting better very, very fast. So even if I don't have a job on voting day, I'm pretty sure that by January, if not sooner, I'll have one, and then things will be good from here on. Keep the president incumbent. He knows what he's doing. We're in a situation where the economic situation is continuing to get worse. In the week that is ending as you and I speak, there are 2.4 million new unemployment claims. Now, that's not as terrible as what happened in March or April, but it's 3 times as bad as the single worst week of the 2008-2009 crisis. So we haven't even hit bottom yet from an unemployment point of view. Maybe we'll hit bottom in June. Maybe we'll hit bottom in July. How long do we stay at the bottom? When is there there's no way there's going to be any pace of recovery by voting day, November. So Trump's got a desperate situation. And so his only plan is to try to rev up racial antipathy. And a lot of this is not even like, it's not like it's a good plan. It's just what he does. But he's in a lot of trouble. And so the premise of Trumpocalypse is he's probably going to lose on voting day. And then we have to say, where are we? How do we make sure that we don't have a terrible transition with a defeated Trump in power for 3 months? And how do we build a different kind of future so we're not vulnerable to this kind of presidency ever again?
Well, let me ask you this. Can Democrats still snatch defeat from the jaws of victory and lose this election to Trump?
Look, it's possible, and they're Democrats. So, I, having spent a lot of my life on the other side, you just watch them and you think, you guys are often very nice people, but great neighbors. But I think the economic situation, you'd have to do a lot to blow an election like this, because the core argument is things are really hard. And people are scared, and there isn't a lot of hope right now. And the hope that Trump keeps offering is false hope. In the summer of 2012, when Bill Clinton gave the speech renominating Barack Obama for a second term, it was a very powerful speech in which he talked about how there had been a lot of economic improvement since 2010, but many people still didn't feel it. And he said, if you renew Barack Obama's contract for another 4 years, you will feel it. I promise you that. And that was not a crazy thing to promise people, because things really were better in 2012 than they'd been in 2010, if not enough better. How do you make a promise to people today that if Donald Trump is elected, things will be better? Things are continuing to get worse. Things are obviously going to be, I think a year from now, things will not be worse than they are now, but we're going to have tens of millions of people out of work a year from now.
And you propose a number of long-term reforms, including some ways to expand voting rights. And, you know, it would seem like common sense that a functioning democracy would want to make it as easy as possible for every voice to be heard. And yet Republicans have resisted even modest voting reforms under the guise of the supposed concern about voting fraud. Do you think the pandemic might finally be the thing to persuade reasonable conservatives to embrace voting rights and things like absentee voting? I mean, I don't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat. No sane person wants to go out there and risk their life to go vote.
One of my big concerns has been in the Trump years that Republicans have accepted that they cannot prevail in Democratic competition, or their ideas can't. So this happens to political parties all the time. You know, you got a bunch of ideas that worked in the 50s and 60s, and then they stopped working in the 70s. And at that point, some innovative politician comes along and says, "Look, the voters don't like our message. Let's adjust it. We keep our principles, but we update it." You know, like what Bill Clinton did to the Democratic Party of Walter Mondale and Michael Dukakis. That was obviously not in keeping with the times, and Bill Clinton kept some things from the old, adjusted the new, and was successful. Because the voters, after all, are theoretically ultimately in charge. What Republicans have been doing since the Great Recession is saying the voters don't like our message. We're not going to change the message. Instead, we're going to change the voters. And that, from my point of view, you just need to take that option off the table. And you need to say to Republicans, sorry, you cannot shrink the electorate so you can keep your message unchanged. You have to accept the voters are the voters. Every American citizen is entitled to vote. And that should be as fair as possible within the constitutional limits of the country. And you need to adapt your ideas. And it's for your own good as Republicans that we're going to take away from you the option of shrinking the electorate. Now, I talk in the book about things that are feasible. I don't think any Republican, or very many, are going to change their minds in 2021 about making voting more accessible. But the things I'm talking about doing are all things that you can do without constitutional amendments and in a reasonable way. So one of the suggestions I have, for example, is there's a census in 2020. Let's hope it's completed properly. Democrats are going to make gains in the state legislatures in the elections of 2020. And so they will have the opportunity to do unto Republicans in 2020 what Republicans did unto them after 2010. Republicans, one of the reasons we had so many conservative governments in the 2010s is Republicans did well in state elections in 2010 and then wrote a bunch of maps that favored them. So I would propose to Democrats that in states that they end up controlling, that you draw two maps. So here's the map we could do. Here's the map that's fair. Tell you what, here we are. We control, let us say, North Carolina. We'll do a fair map for North Carolina if you do a fair map for Georgia. Mm-hmm. And if you don't do it, we'll do the other map, the one that we can do. So here they are. You choose. Now, ideally, we move away from a world in which politicians draw their own maps. I mean, in no other democracy on earth do you let the politicians draw the maps. Different countries have different ways of doing it. But generally, they say, sorry, the maps should be fair. I mean, what do you mean? That shouldn't be an issue that you have fair maps. In the United States, it is for complex historical reasons. So use the power of the elections of 2020 to make the maps more fair. Well, I have some other suggestions, too.
Well, I want to wind up here by talking a little bit about the impact of Trumpism on your party, the Republican Party, or perhaps I should ask, do you still consider yourself a Republican? Are you registered as a Republican?
I am a registered Republican.
Okay.
And I live in the District of Columbia. I have to say, if I lived in the state of California, mm-hmm. I'm sure I'd be voting for Republican candidates for the state assembly and state senate.
But you can't because you live in D.C.
I can't. I live in D.C. But
you have no governor. You have no senator.
But I mean, if on most non-federal issues, especially outside of the Deep South, I would probably find myself Thinking, okay, we need a more business friendly environment here. I'd like to see the taxes be lowered. I think government can be streamlined. Definitely a big advocate of choice in education. Um, uh, Definitely think that public service jobs should not pay more than their private sector counterparts, that kind of thing. So I'd be a pretty conservative person in a state like California, or if I lived in New York State. But I think we need two parties that are committed to the ideals of liberal democracy. And right now, under Trump, the Republicans are not. And it's going to take some learning to change that. And we learn through pain.
Well, even though you're still a registered Republican, I know that you voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016, like a number of more traditional Republicans. Do you think a Clinton win would have been better for the Republican Party in the long term?
I think a Clinton win would have been better for America, obviously. And I think President Clinton would have handled this present crisis much more competently than President Trump did. That said, I worry that had Clinton won, we would have gotten all of the evil of Trumpism. We've had a paranoid, angry, racialist party that would have been driven into radical misogyny by a female presidency, and they would not have had the learning experience that I hope they're going to get from what happens to them in 2020. So it might have been worse for the Republican Party. We might have had a better, and it might have been worse for the long-term health of the United States. I mean, I ended my previous Trump book by talking about the gifts of Trump and how in some ways he has taught us things that we needed to know and has given us opportunities to build a better country after him than we had before him. And in Trumpocalypse, I'm, if anything, even more optimistic about this. I'm not an optimistic person by temperament, but we have had a terrible lesson. And I just think we're a learning species. And Americans, such a practical, in every other aspect of life, who are more practical than Americans? Get the job done, build the bridge, make the business work, take over Dad's barn and build a stage, do the show, go to Broadway. Americans believe they can get things. They don't wait for other people to make things happen for them. They make things happen, right? Can't we do that politically and just get a government that isn't an embarrassment compared to the rest of the democratic world?
Yeah, and I have to hand it to you. I love a good political Judy Garland, Mickey Rooney reference. Especially from a Republican.
Yeah. Well, I think Mickey Rooney was a Republican, actually.
I think you're right, actually.
Yeah, there's a weird thing where there were weird numbers of Hollywood personalities who you never thought were Republicans. Like I was reading this the other day, like Jesse Owens, who won all those medals at the 1936 Nazi Olympics, was a huge Republican and campaigned for Eisenhower in 1952 and 56.
I didn't know that, but I think I did know about Mickey Rooney, and I only knew him toward the end of his life, and he was pretty cranky, but I think politics did come up a couple of times, and he was pretty conservative, surprisingly. Well, I want to close by asking you, looking ahead, in the unlikely event that Trump wins a second term, is that a death blow to the GOP? Can the Republican Party that survive that?
If there's a Trump second term, and I don't believe there will be, and if Republicans rally to it, I don't think they deserve to survive it. You can do something like this once and afterwards vow to the world, I will never, ever, ever mix tequila and Quaaludes ever again. But you do it twice. This is now beginning to become worse than a habit. This is an identity. If that's who you are, you're the French National Front. You are the alternative for Germany. You're a fascist. You're a fascist party, and then you're just a menace. But I think there was an opportunity for us, if after a Trump defeat, to rebalance American politics. Liberal and conservative. That's just hardwired in the structure of the human brain. There's some people who are more open to new experiences. Some people are more attached to familiar experiences. There's some people who are more cosmopolitan. Some people who are less cosmopolitan. It's just part of what makes us human. That kind of brain chemistry. And so there will, your local culture will tell you what the content of the left and right is, but you're going to have it. You have to make them both be broadly acceptable. The democracy is premised on the idea I can live with the other guy. I'm not going to love it, but
Exactly.
they get their at bat, and I try to catch every hit, but eventually I'll get my at bat. But I'm not allowed to like punch the batter in the face. I'm not allowed to steal things. I'm not allowed to cheat. I'm not allowed to terrorize the parents who come to cheer on the other team. But Republican Party has been playing politics through the Tea Party era and into the Trump era in ways that just aren't acceptable in a democratic country.
Right. It's inevitable that that pendulum is going to swing back and there will be some type of reaction to Trumpism. And that's the case that I make to my conservative friends who've embraced Trump, is that it is a certainty that sooner or later a Democrat will control the White House. What are they going to do when all the checks and balances have been scuttled to accommodate the whims of an aspiring autocrat, and even more power has been concentrated in the presidency? What are they going to say when a Democrat president uses those exact same tools and it's too late? You already broke the seal. You can't put that genie back in the bottle. Who knows if that president is going to be able to resist the temptation to use all of those tools and to take advantage of the president's newly expanded powers? What are you going to do then? Do they think this honeymoon is just going to last forever?
But here's a rule that the Trump people have announced. The president does not have to submit by oversight by congressional committees headed by the other party. So the Trump people just say, we do not answer questions in the House of Representatives. We don't provide them with documents. We do not accept their right to oversee us. We will talk to the Senate because they're Republicans and their questions are never too embarrassing. We won't talk to the House. So is that, so that's the rule? The president doesn't have to answer Congress when, is that the rule? Do you want to play by that rule? Or what we've been seeing in the past week is as the Trump people try to argue they were somehow the victims in the Russian attack on American democracy in 2016. They have been selectively declassifying documents for polemical purposes. That's never happened before. But is that a rule of politics? So the next president can declassify the conversation between Jared Kushner and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, can declassify there will be records of these things, can declassify Trump's conversations with Putin. And maybe we have to go through that too. I mean, maybe, as I said, we learn from pain, but the risk is that instead of tit for tat, where we get better, that we reset politics on a new and much more vicious level. And so the challenge for the next president, this is the theme of the book, is how do you do enough justice that people see justice to be done, but not so much revenge that we put American politics onto a new and more bloodthirsty path.
Yeah, we've certainly got a lot to do to slow down that pendulum. Yeah. Well, I really enjoyed the book. I encourage folks to read it. Again, it's called Trumpocalypse, Restoring American Democracy. David Frum, thanks for talking with me.
Thank you so much, Ben. That was fun.
Thanks again to David Frum for coming on the podcast. Order Trumpocalypse, Restoring American Democracy on Amazon, Audible, or wherever books are sold. Read more of David's writings in The Atlantic magazine and follow David at davidfrum.com or on Twitter at @davidfrum. If you enjoyed today's podcast, be sure to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and rate and review us while you're there. 5-star ratings and detailed reviews are one of the best ways for new listeners to discover the show. You can also follow us on Facebook or on Twitter at @KickassNewsPod and recommend us to your friends on your social media. For more fun stuff, visit kickassnews.com, and I welcome your comments, questions, and suggestions at comments@kickassnews.com. For now, I'm Ben Mathis, and thanks for listening to Kick-Ass News.